Hello and welcome to my video all about how to do the alternating long tail cast on. The advantage of this alternating cast on compared to the standard long tail cast on is that if you're knitting some kind of knit and purl pattern such as seed stitch or ribbing, then this alternating cast on edge just blends so much better into your knitting. Before watching this video, I definitely would recommend that you get familiar with how to do the long tail cast on, both the knitwise method, which is the standard, and the purlwise method. I'll link to my videos on these topics in the description. Here you can see me doing the standard knitwise long tail cast on, which is probably familiar to you. This method creates little diagonal strands of yarn on the side of the cast on edge that's facing you, and I'll call this side the smooth side. On the other side are little purl bumps, and I'll call this the bumpy side. I then did a few rows of stockinette stitch, starting with a purl row, and now you can see that smooth side of the cast on edge a lot more clearly. And on the back is the bumpy side. As you can see, it's a neat cast on edge, and very nice for a stitch like stockinette stitch where it's the same all the way across. However, what if you're using a stitch pattern which alternates between knits and purls across your knitting, such as seed stitch or ribbing? Well, in those cases, I would say that the alternating long tail cast on would be a better choice. And the reason for that is because then the cast on edge becomes part of the knitting pattern and therefore blends in. Here you can see a sample of some 2x2 ribbing, and I've done the standard knitwise long tail cast on along the bottom edge. You can see those little diagonal strands of yarn along the cast on edge, which is the smooth side, and you can see that it doesn't blend in at all with the knitting. Instead, it's a continuous line and kind of stands out from the knitting. To improve this edge, you can alternate between doing the long tail cast on knitwise and purlwise in order to fit in with the pattern you're about to knit. I'll now be demonstrating the alternating long tail cast on using this 2x2 ribbing pattern. Row 1, which represents the right side, is knit 2, purl 2 repeated, whilst row 2, which represents the wrong side, is purl 2, knit 2 repeated. When you're casting on using the alternating long tail cast on, you need to pick one of these rows. If you're using circular knitting, you will of course have to use a right side row, because in circular knitting you only knit the right side. However, if you're doing flat knitting, which is what I'm doing today, you need to choose between a right side row and a wrong side row for the cast on. This will all depend on what you want the first row of your knitting pattern to be, i.e. what row of pattern do you want to start with after your cast on edge. For instance, I want to start my knitting project on the wrong side row, which is purl 2, knit 2 repeated. Therefore, I know that the cast on edge needs to follow the right side row pattern, which is knit 2, purl 2 repeated. So even though a cast on edge doesn't count as a row in your project, you're making it follow the same pattern as the rest of your knitting. Okay, so with all that in mind, let's get on with doing the alternating cast on. As I said earlier, it will be a lot easier to follow if you already know how to do the long tail cast on, both knitwise and purlwise. You'll begin as normal by leaving a long yarn tail, about 3.5 times the width of your knitting project, and then making a slip knot. Put this slip knot on the needle and tighten. This slip knot counts as your first stitch, and it can be a knit stitch or a purl stitch, it's kind of neutral. Mine is going to represent a knit stitch. Once you're in the slingshot position, you can then cast on your edge, following whatever pattern of knits and purls you want. As I've already shown, I'm going to be following a knit 2, purl 2 pattern. Since I'm counting the slip knot as a knit stitch, I now need to cast on one more knit stitch. So I take my right hand needle underneath the strand of yarn in front of my thumb, from front to back, then down behind the strand of yarn in front of my finger from back to front, and then down through the loop around my thumb. Release the loop and tighten. Then I need to cast on the next 2 stitches purlwise. So I take my right hand needle down and under the strand of yarn behind my finger from back to front. And then underneath the strand of yarn behind my thumb, from back to front and up and down through the loop around my finger. I then release this loop and tighten. I've now cast on one purl stitch and I need to cast on one more. And I just need to repeat that until the end. So I need to cast on 2 stitches knitwise, and then 2 stitches purlwise. Then 2 stitches knitwise, and then 2 stitches purlwise, and so on. If you're flat knitting and you've just done a right side pattern row, you'll now need to do a wrong side pattern row, and vice versa. So in my case, I need to do purl 2, knit 2 and repeat. Or, since this is ribbing, you can just read your knitting to know what you need to knit next. So where there's a purl bump next to the needle, you need to purl that stitch. And where there isn't a purl bump, you need to knit that stitch. And that's because ribbing is created by knitting the knits and purling the purls. So now basically you just follow your knitting pattern. Here you can see I've done quite a few more rows of 2x2 ribbing, and you can see the cast on edge along the bottom. You'll see that there are diagonal strands of yarn at the bottom of the knit stitch columns, and purl bumps at the bottom of the purl stitch columns, i.e. the smooth side of the cast on edge is next to the knits, and the bumpy side is next to the purls. That's on both sides, which makes this a reversible cast on edge. If you compare this edge to the standard long-tail cast-on edge, you'll see that this alternating cast-on blends in a lot better with the knitting. So it's really personal preference if you want to use this cast-on or not, but I think it's worth the effort, especially for a stitch like ribbing. And that's it. I really hope you found this video useful, and thank you very much for watching.